Awesome. We still have 1 minute to go.
Oops, do you want to go back to the slide
Yeah.
deck?
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on which part of the world you are, guys. My name is Paresh Mutiola. I'll be your moderator for the day, and accompanied by Julie Bloomquist, who is the backup just in case. Okay, so thank you. This is the DBA virtual group, and this is the way you can get in touch with us through Twitter, through the LinkedIn group, through Meetup, and our email is dbavug@outlook.com. We absolutely do monitor that mailbox. Okay, so if you have any questions or comments, bouquets, brickbats, feel free to use that. If you want to speak, you have a suggestion or a feedback, you can't access the shares or the YouTube videos, send us an email and we will send you all that information back as soon as possible. Um, so when do we meet? So we meet second Wednesday at noon Eastern time and fourth Wednesday noon at Pacific Daylight Time. So just to cover both the ends of USA basically. But we still have people who kind of sign in from New Zealand and Australia and so on. So uh, and where do I get the recordings? So you can get them at this link, or you can just scan this awesome QR code and you should be able to get to that. This is the most popular question, by the way. So, is the recording going to be available? Yes, the recording is going to be available. Julie has already started the recording. Okay. And these are the forthcoming sessions on our behalf. As you can see, today it was supposed to be Melody, but we switched because of some scheduling conflict. But under the 6-part series of Cloud DBA, we are done with 4. Today is the 5th session. Next 2 weeks, we'll have Melody come back and she'll be presenting her same other topic as well. But yeah, feel free to go through this. Okay, this is supposed to click and Past Summit is back. So if you think you're learning too much here, wait till you actually go to Past Summit. It's like drinking out of a fire hose. And there are some future free events coming up like SQL Saturdays and Data Saturdays. On the top, you can see SQLSaturday.com and DataSaturdays.com. Um, they, they're really great one-day resource. A lot of these awesome people who you cannot easily meet, you can meet them at these events here. So, and Joey, oh wait, I had to cover one more thing here. SQL Saturday Boston has been announced for October 5, and I would strongly suggest seeing you guys there. If I'm selected, I'll be there as well. Club it with 3-4 days of downtime and go visit the mountains for the foliage. That's a perfect time of the year to go there. Okay, cool. And without much ado, my good friend Joseph Anthony, we call him Joey, and he's going to talk to us about securing our data in Azure. So I will stop sharing. And Joey, you want to take it over, sir?
Yeah, thanks. I'm there. I hope everybody can see my screen. Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Joey Dantoni. This is kind of a last-minute presentation, so hence the older slide deck here. But we're going to do a lot of demos and stuff to kind of walk you through this, and we're going to talk about things like at both a conceptual level as well as a detailed architectural level as to how they work in Azure. All the demos I'm going to be doing are very specific to Azure. A lot of the concepts I'm going to talk about here are going to be applicable to all 3 major clouds, so Google and Amazon. Security is one of those places where things operate kind of quite differently across each of the 3 cloud platforms. And we'll talk through that as we go through, but let's go ahead and get started. I'm Joey Dantoni. I'm principal consultant at Denny Cherry & Associates Consulting. You can find me at my blog at joeydantoni.com, where I don't write enough anymore, but I also have a monthly column at redmondmag.com called Joey on SQL Server. I'm also on Twitter. I'm not going to call it X, at jdanton. And you can usually find me speaking at various events somewhere around the world. Let's talk about security. This is one of my favorite topics. The first thing I want to talk about, and you're a DBA audience, so you're going to know this, I hope. And if you don't, I'll make sure you do. Security and data recovery go hand in hand. And there are a lot of aspects to security, and I could spend all day talking about security because it's one of my favorite topics. And it's something that, especially, I don't even want to say non-IT companies, basically in not military companies, security is something that is far underinvested in. Software companies don't do enough investments in security, so a lot of times we end up having, as administrators, to do good security, we end up having to manage a lot of gaps. Companies don't invest in security, generally speaking, until something bad happens. One of the best things I think that has happened to the security landscape in recent years is as companies have bought cybersecurity insurance with protections against ransomware, those cybersecurity insurance vendors have come up with like a set of standards that companies have to manage or meet in order to get their insurance payment paid out. And that has actually helped security more than anything. So I've seen more and more of my clients do more security things because of those requirements than I have probably in the previous 20 years I had worked in IT. There are threat actors everywhere. So if anybody was at SQL Saturday Atlanta, I gave a talk on the kind of the threat landscape and what it looks like right now. And you have nation state actors like Russia, Iran, North Korea, to an extent China, that are all actively going after interesting and non-interesting US based targets and other targets in other countries as well in the Western world. Those attacks in some cases are ransomware attacks, and in some cases there are other kinds of attacks that are even a little bit scarier than ransomware attacks. But our first line of defense against any of these things is backups. And one of the reasons why I like to tie these two things together is I think a lot of folks understand that backups are important, but they don't just understand how important they are. And they don't understand how backups also need to be protected. And this is something I think DBAs don't necessarily know because you maybe don't have the security exposure. Probably the biggest trend in backup technology in recent years has been the move for everything to be immutable. And if you're old like me, you might remember backing up the tape. Well, tape had this really wonderful benefit that it was effectively offline, and you wrote to it, you wrote to it and you pulled the tape out of the library and then you put the tape in a metal box and that was your backup. Nobody can update a tape that's sitting in a metal box. We've had cloud vendors and we've had backup vendors all go through a lot of various technology iterations just to try to imitate that metal box. So having backups that are online is not good, obviously, because if you can see a backup file from your desktop and you're logged into the domain and you're authorized to see the file share the backups are on, that means the ransomware attack can see them. And if your backups are pwned, then you're kind of screwed. And so like having offline backups are really one of the more important things we're going to talk about. And it's something you should test throughout. And the reasons why data security and data recovery go hand in hand. You can't recover from an attack without backups. You can't restore your backups if they've been pwned. One of the things that we see ransomware attackers doing is taking advantage of not just like encrypting entire file systems, because one of the things what happens when you encrypt, say, very large files. So let's say you wanted to encrypt a database and or a database backup file, or as we like to call it at DCAC, surprise TDE. You never want surprise TDE. You want to be in control of your TDE. If you encrypt the whole file as an attacker, that's going to generate a lot of CPU cycles because you need to read the entire file, right? So that's going to take a long time to read. That's also going to take a lot of CPU cycles because you're having to encrypt every page of that file. What some attackers have shifted to is just encrypting a handful of random pages in the file because it's much less obvious on a system monitoring chart that like CPU on this random file server spiked to 100% for, 20 minutes to an hour, and it's just as effective. If you have 5 encrypted pages in your backup that SQL Server is not expecting it to have, it's just as good as if you had the entire backup encrypted. One of the other aspects of data security and and data recovery that is kind of critically important and doesn't seem like it would necessarily be tied into security, but it is data governance. And this also like ties into GDPR a lot too, because one of the things about data governance is when you have good data governance in place, you know where all of your data lives, you know what systems that data is in, and you know where your sensitive data is. This lets you prioritize data protections for your most sensitive data. It also lets you, you know, have a list and put better controls around those environments. The big issue with data governance, and it's not really a issue that IT can do anything about, because it's not really an IT problem, or an IT. It is IT's problem. IT shouldn't really run data governance. IT as an organization doesn't know what business data is critical to the business. That's kind of the business's job. So that's the everlasting complexity of data governance. It shouldn't be super expensive, or it shouldn't be super challenging to do, but it is, because you need to have IT and the business both involved. And that allows you to kind of segregate your data into types of systems and lets you make better security decisions. And we'll talk about all that as we go through the slides in this deck. The cloud complicates everything with data security because you have a lot more options. But it's also, it can be harder to do things in a secure fashion. So you want to ensure that you're protecting your database backups, you're protecting all of your backups. You have a backup strategy. In some cases, your backup strategy may be to rebuild VMs and restore databases. That's kind of a different approach. All these things are things to keep in mind as you think about your backups and if they're protected. And I mentioned something on the last slide that I think is really important, networking. And to me, networking is probably the most important aspect of security. I know as database professionals, we tend to not think of networking all the time unless we're doing something like building an availability group. But it really is the most important thing in terms of security. If you, from your machine on your corporate network, can open SQL Server Management Studio and connect to your databases, or even worse, if you can open AD tools and connect to a domain controller and be a domain admin, those things are all really, really bad. That's not good. So there's a few aspects to this. Organizations should not just have one single big pipe in and out of their network. In a zero trust approach, which is the way a lot of modern network designs, networks are segmented into smaller islands where specific workloads are contained. Each segment is going to have its own ingress and egress controls to minimize the blast impact of unauthorized access to data. You don't want one, senior manager getting phished and then ransomware to be malware, I should say, to be able to do lateral movement across your entire environment. So one of the reasons why that's so dangerous, let's say you have a low privilege user, right? And we're going to assume your entire network is flat. We're also going to assume that you as a DBA or a domain admin just have a single credential. Like you use, in my case, Dantoni or JDanHan is popular for my username. I'm going to pretend that, or Joey at DCAC, I'm going to pretend that account is domain admin. If somebody hacks, a senior manager, I think Denny's smart enough not to click on a phishing attack, but you never know. And they get into our domain, right? And we have a completely flat domain, which we at DCAC don't. One of the first things they're going to do is kind of enumerate the domain because they have an active user. That user may not be highly privileged, but if they can get across the domain and maybe they can land on a file server where a lot of people have access, and they can do something like Kerberoasting, which is going to grab credentials out of memory, they might be able to find a domain admin's credentials if you're regularly logging into that server. And yes, this is all scary. Once they have the domain admin's credentials, since your network is flat and there are no controls, they can go anywhere as domain admin, and now they can do everything. So all this stuff is kind of painful. Like, it's harder to have a hub and spoke network, and it's perimeters. You have to set firewall rules all the time, and it's challenging, and you're going to have to probably go through a couple of hops to log into managed servers. But at the same time, if you don't do this, you're totally at risk. And one of the things about security that you always have to remember is you don't have to have the best security in the world. You just have to be, better than most other people. So if, as they say, if you're being chased by the bear, you don't have to be the fastest runner. You just have to be the second slowest one. Effectively, you have the same thing with security. One of the things that's important to understand is that cloud applications additionally can open up endpoints to external environments like the internet or your on-premises footprint. And those are at risk of attacks from those environments. So it's important you have scan that traffic for things like malicious payloads or logic. And these threats are going to fall into two broad categories. These are going to be known attacks, and these are going to be threats that have been discovered by your software provider or a larger community. In some cases, you may know what the attack signature is, or you may have, malware detection software that knows what that's going to look like. And the key to this is being able to update that threat detection engine with those known attacks. Unknown attacks, and these are threats that don't quite match any known signatures. These can be 0 days or unusual patterns in request traffic. The ability to detect such attacks depends on how well your defenses are at knowing what's normal and what's not. And your defense tooling should be constantly learning and updating such patterns as your business and associated traffic evolves. A third objective here is to focus on adding encryption and ensuring that user to app traffic is encrypted. And once you've accomplished all these things, one of the things you really want to do is partition your apps into different subnets. For the most part, if you're designing a network properly, your SQL servers shouldn't be able to talk to each other. And I know that, especially I've been in a lot of organizations that had everything designed where everything could talk to everything. That shouldn't necessarily be the case. Another thing that I'm kind of running into lately, and I don't want to say AD is a security risk because it's not, and you get better security controls with AD than you do without. But servers don't necessarily need to belong to a domain. They can, and there are some benefits to that. But one of the things we've seen organizations do is create a separate server domain from their user domain, or better yet, strictly use AD for server applications or in servers, and for Windows laptops in the user space, only use Azure Active Directory or Intra ID joining. The reason for that is those hybrid join machines are loosely connected to the domain, so they don't have the inherent ability to talk to each other the way AD machines do. So let's talk about how all this works in the cloud and walk through some of the problems we see. So one of the biggest, I think, issues with cloud and cloud security is that, especially for folks that are new to the cloud, security is very different than it was in an on-premises environment. There are a lot of different paradigms that are, in place that you have to think about, and there's a lot of data that's out there that is pretty important. One of the biggest problems we've seen in cloud data is that I'm sorry, if you're not on mute, could you please put yourself on mute? One of the problems we've seen in cloud data is probably the biggest breach is if you Google, I have a browser up because I was going to go to Azure, but here we'll go to news.google.com. And we're going to search S3 data breach. and Google can't sort anything by date anymore because it doesn't like it. But as you can see, April 11th, April 30th, March 25th. Amazon S3's the Amazon equivalent of Azure Blob Storage. For a long time in the early days of Amazon, this defaulted to being open to the internet. I will say one of the things I like about Azure as opposed to AWS is it's a lot easier to configure security in Azure than it is AWS. But we have all these data types that are out there, and they're all in various different services. In like the first three here, so files, databases, blobs, and I'll add queues to this. Each of those are separate places we can store data in Azure, right? And they all kind of have their own security model. Like storage accounts have a firewall. It works slightly differently than the way an Azure database firewall works. We can also set up private networking on those if we want to. All these things are kind of challenging. We also have other data like email and chat and log. So log analytics or CloudWatch on AWS. That's all data that needs to be secured too. So what do we need to do? So the first thing to talk about is role-based access control. This is the basis of all cloud. I'm just going to go straight into demo after this. And then we're going to talk about best practices. We have to talk about database permissions because that's going to operate at a separate layer than cloud permissions. And then we're going to talk about understanding private and public endpoints. All right, so let's go into my Azure subscription. So I'm logged into DCACs. I'm going to no, I thought I had my privacy plugin on. I don't. So we'll just kind of walk from here. So the first thing I want to mention is I'm logged in. You can see here I'm Joey at dcac.com. That's using an intra ID authentication. I did have to use multi-factor authentication. I'm going to be really brave and sign out during this demo. And if I can find my mouse. There's my cursor. We'll sign out. And we'll go ahead and sign back in. And I'm going to say other ways to sign in. I can approve a request on my Microsoft Authenticator app, but I can also use a security key. So here I'm going to use a security key. I have a YubiKey plugged into my Mac. I just touched it, and now I'm entering the PIN, and I'll enter it again. So that authenticated me. We're going to talk about multi-factor authentication in a second, but by all means, everybody who's logging into the cloud should have multi-factor authentication. One of the other things that is important to think about is you want to think about your cloud security, kind of like if you're running VMware on-prem. You want to think about it like you're thinking about your vCenter security, because not every team has to have full access to the cloud, and you have pretty granular controls over how you can do things. One of the things I first want to mention, and I'm going to demo it because I need to demo it to demo the rest of the stuff.
Hey, Joey?
Yeah.
I think a couple of people just reached out to me. Is there any ways we can kind of magnify this or zoom in?
Okay, it's pretty zoomed in, but there's 200%. So.
Oh, wow. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, like it was 170 before. All right. So here I'm going to go to Microsoft Entra Privileged Identity Management. Privileged Identity Management is a key aspect of security. It is part of Entra P2. So you effectively either need to pay separately for P2, or you need to have Office 365 / Microsoft 365 M5 to use this. Also, by the way, you can zoom in your Teams window now. That's a recent addition. So hopefully everybody's on a relatively recent version of Teams. But yeah, we're pretty zoomed in. But privileged identity management allows you to escalate. So like, I'll open this in a new tab. So as of right now, I'm nothing. I'm just a regular user. in Azure because I haven't escalated my permissions yet. So here, if I go to users and I want to see, this will let me see sign-in logs. So here, if I go to see sign-in logs, I see I don't have access to this data. Please contact your global administrator. Well, guess what? I am a global administrator, except I'm not in that role right now. So here, I'm going to go ahead and activate that role so I can show you guys everything else. I'm going to activate it for an hour. A demo for the DBA-VUG. So at DCAC, I can just hit activate and do this. And this buys us a little bit of security. It doesn't necessarily buy us as much security as we could possibly have. We could make this a workflow so that, like, if I wanted to be global administrator, Denny or somebody else would have to approve it. We don't have really enough sensitive data that we're worried about that, or regulatory controls. But that is something we can do. So what this is actually doing, so it activates my role, and in the end, it's going to automatically refresh my browser. And the token, the authentication token I'm going to have is then going to have privileges for me to be global admin. So if you watch this, it's going to refresh in 2, 1, and now. And you see that refresh. And so likewise, if I refresh this screen, hopefully it will pick up the new token. Yeah, and I can see my sign-in logs now. I don't get that error message, and you can see all my sign-ins that I just did. So that's privileged identity management. One of the aspects of this that's kind of cool is you don't necessarily have to, if you don't have Office E5 licensing, you don't necessarily have to buy this for all of your users. This is largely E5 comes with stuff that is largely only needed by administrators and executives. So realistically, you're probably safe buying it for your executives and your system admins. The other thing I really want to talk about that I feel like you can't run Azure security without, and this is just our core security as to authentication and roles around Azure or Intra, Azure Active Directory, is conditional access. So conditional access is a policy engine that lets you have various rules in place that can force stuff. So here we have require multi-factor authentication for admins, block legacy authentication, require multi-factor for all users, and yes, those two things overlap. We also have, this one's kind of interesting. Everybody in our organization has YubiKeys. With this specific policy, we're requiring, that wasn't what I wanted. We have this condition. This is what I was looking for. So here we can specify high or medium risk for the policy to be enforced. So if the user, if Azure thinks the user account's compromised, it can configure this policy. And what this would do would be force those high risk logins to log in with a higher factor of authentication. So that's just a sample of what you can do. You can go really crazy with some of the things you can do. There's a custom controls here. But the big thing there is that's how conditional access policies work. Conditional access lets you do a whole lot of things. It's really powerful. It's really hard to do good security without it. One of the other things I want to talk about here is the hierarchy of permissions in Azure. So one of the things a lot of folks don't necessarily know about is management groups. By the way, you may notice the way I'm navigating the portal. A couple of things, I go to the side because I see the logos there. If you don't know where something is, the easiest way to navigate the portal is typing what you want in this white box at the top of the screen, or the box may be a different color if you're in dark mode or something. But the search in the portal is really good. So if you don't know if you roughly know what you're looking for, but you don't know where to find it, navigate there. Here, I'm navigating to management groups. And this is kind of an important aspect, especially for larger organizations. So some smaller organizations may only have one subscription. It's getting pretty rare. It used to be that it was a real pain in the neck to create a subscription. It's a lot easier now. So a lot of organizations will, give each functional unit in their organization their own subscription. They might have subscriptions for dev, test, QA, and prod just to keep things separate. And as you can imagine, if you end up with even 5 or 6 subscriptions like we have, so we have 6, if you had to assign permissions in each of those, it would be kind of a nightmare to keep track of, right? You'd have to, even if you had some PowerShell to do it, it's still like a pain in the neck. Management groups gives us another layer in the hierarchy. So here we have a development and a production management group. So like here, if I look in this development management group and I go to access control IAM. So this access control IAM is pretty much universal around any resource in Azure that you can secure. And this is going to show you where the access control policies are and what they are. And you can see the role assignments. In Azure, I don't actually have any privilege role assignments here. That's weird. And try production. Actually, I think everything is from tenant root group. Either that or I just got fired. Yeah, here we go. So you can see Denny and I are both owners of this tenant resource group. What that means is our roles are going to cascade down from that resource group. So here I'm in the management group, or excuse me, management group. I'll navigate to an individual subscription. And I'll look at access control IAM and I'll say role assignments. And you can see Denny and I have inherited this role assignment from a couple of different management groups. That's why we're there twice. We have some other roles and other people who have access to stuff. And if I switch over to Dev Test Lab where more people are going to have access, you can see we have more people in our environment who have access to this subscription and can do stuff. So that's just another way it works. The hierarchy of permissions goes from management group to subscription, then down to resource group. So resource groups are a way to contain resources. So like if I look here, backups, access control IAM, I'm going to have owner access to this because it's inherited, as is Denny. You can block those inheritance with a deny, but in this case, we're not doing that. There's resource groups. So like if I go back to my overview of my resource groups, those cascade down into individual resources. So here, this is a storage account. If I go into access control here, I'm going to see the same thing, that everything's going to get inherited down. The lowest level you can assign permissions is at the resource group level, or excuse me, at the individual resource level. Typically, for project type work, you're going to want to assign permissions at a resource group level. For larger kind of administrative work where you're assigning groups, you're going to want to do that either at a subscription level or even at a management group level, just to simplify that. One of the other things you should note too, and this is kind of something, well, let's talk about SQL, because one of the things that's challenging about SQL, and this is SQL Azure, VMs are different. Database VMs are kind of the same everywhere they live. But with databases, you'll notice I don't have, on a specific database, I don't have that access control IAM thing here. All database permissions are still controlled within the database, with a couple of exceptions. And we're going to navigate back out to the server. And remember, in Azure SQL Database, servers are a logical construct. They're not actually a physical thing. They are a physical thing that exists somewhere, but it's not like an actual SQL server. And I need to delete this database, by the way. So we're going to go ahead and delete that. And I can do that because I have authorization. So let's delete this. And we'll go back to our server. In here, you can see access control IAM. So you can see the role assignments. And I just want to see if there are any specific. I don't have any. Here I have a specific SQL DB, SQL Server contributor. Uh, so those roles are specific to this type of resource. So like if I want to add a role assignment, I'll just go ahead and type SQL, and this search box should show us everything that's there. Apparently, they need to add an index on this search. But here you can see in the bottom where it's grayed out, you can manage SQL databases but not access them. You can manage security-related processes but not access. However, the one place you can do stuff is if we go back to the server, there's a server admin here. It's me, it's Jay Dantoni. Also, there's a Microsoft Entra admin. So anybody who's in the SQL admins group can auth to this database server, and they're effectively like SA. It's not quite SA because in Azure SQL Database, you aren't SA. But those are the two places where you can, in the control plane, as we call it, of the SQL server, where you can set up access. But like if I wanted to assign access for a user to run some reports, there's no place for me to do that. That's all done within the database itself. And for example, if I navigate to AdventureWorks here and I go to the query editor, here I'm going to authenticate as myself. And admittedly, this is kind of slow. I don't know why. I don't know what's going on. This database might be serverless, so it might be sleeping. But I can authenticate as myself here. By the way, fun fact, this query editor, even though it's running in the portal, in terms of the firewall for Azure SQL Database, has your IP address. So like if we show networking settings here, by default, and this is something we need to talk about, Azure SQL Database lets you add firewall rules. I have a few here. And you can see everybody's has, but I'm sure IPs have changed. These will allow traffic to come in from those firewall rules. You can also completely disable public access, which you might want to do. But then you have to configure private access by creating a private endpoint. And that places those Azure SQL databases effectively within your virtual network. It's not quite that simple because there's like some DNS stuff you have to do that's actually fairly complicated, but that is something you can do in terms of network security. You can control outbound security as well. So there's a lot you can do here with networking. And if you're using Azure SQL Database extensively, it's important to understand that. By the way, managed instance is kind of inherently on a private network. So for managed instance, you don't have to necessarily do all this, but you do have to have your networks configured in such a manner that whatever VM you're trying to connect to your managed instance from can actually talk to that network. Managed endpoint networking or managed instance networking is fairly complicated, so it's probably something for another session. But here we can see this is our Azure SQL database. Where did I want to go from here? So we've looked at Azure SQL, and one of the other things I wanted to talk about is managed identity, because this is kind of interesting. I have this little app here. I'll show you the app. Hopefully it's in my history. I have this little app that runs called VM sizes, and that's way small. VM sizes, VM size DBA-API.azurewebsites.net. It's also mapped. It's also mapped to the DCAC domain. It will show us. It runs like weekly and grabs all of the available VMs, throws them into an Azure SQL database, and connects. But let's talk about the security there because it's kind of interesting. So let me go to that database. And I know it's online. And we'll go ahead and connect. I may have to add no, I'm connected. So the query editor, like I mentioned, is going to run in the context of your IP address. But here I'm going to do a select star from sys.database principals. And one of the things I wanted to show you is, like, you can see, so I have access to this database, and I've granted Monica access to this database, and you can see we're at dcac.com. You also see all these other names like Logic App VM size is Logic App, VM size DB API. Those are all also external users. And what's cool about this is all my authentication for this application is using managed identity. And if you're not familiar with managed identity, in Azure, for any individual resource, like my automation account, which we're going to navigate to here, if I can spell automation correctly, I'm going to exit that screen. Demo for VM sizes. So for most Azure resources, there are a couple that are accepted from this, but I think almost everything has this. You can create a managed identity. You can kind of think of this like Windows authentication, but it's a little bit better. So it's basically, this has this object ID, and it's in my Azure Active Directory. It's kind of in a terrible location in my Azure Active Directory. I'll navigate you there. So you have to click on Enterprise Applications because this is dumb, and somebody should fix this GUI. And then under application type, you can navigate to managed identity. And then you can see all the managed identities in our environment. But the way we authenticate is this. So like here, automation has these run books that we use for PowerShell purposes. And so I have a VM sizes run book here that runs weekly. And if I edit the code here, here I'm in these 4 lines of code. I'll make this a little bit bigger. In like lines 10 through 13 here, I'm authenticating. I'm getting an access token for the identity of this automation runbook by using this connect AZ account -identity .context. So since it's running in that context, I'm getting that. So this automation account has permission, has reader permission to be able to do some things here. This gets all the information about all the VMs. It also has write permission on the storage account. So it's going to write into the storage account, and I'm saying use the connected account that we're connected in. So once again, kind of similar to Windows off. And then this is done. So this writes out to storage. And then I have a cleanup run book that I think might authenticate to a database. That was the thing I wanted to show you. Actually, no, I am not authenticating to my databases here. So I have what's connecting to my database is I have a Logic app. And Logic apps are these cool low-code things you can run that will highlight that will let you do kind of stuff with a trigger and an action. So if anybody's ever used Azure Functions or Power Automate, these are all kind of the same conceptual idea. You'll note while we're waiting for this to load, we have the identity key thing in settings here. I don't know why the portal is being so slow for me today. Something must be up with my internet. Anyway, while we're waiting, this effectively triggers on a schedule, so it runs once a week. Then it runs a stored procedure that actually, I take that back. That automation runbook writes a file, and then that triggers this logic app, which runs a stored procedure to ingest my data. But all this is done through managed identity. And you can do that not just with Azure SQL Database, but since you're a group of database professionals, that's important to understand that you can create access for managed identities. And I know I'm talking about Azure SQL Database, but if you're using SQL Server 22, you can use, and you have it configured for Azure Active Directory off, you can allow managed identities to connect to those databases that use AAD off. So cloud security, you have a lot of options here. Like I mentioned, managed identities are really good. This is something that has really kind of changed in the last 5 or 6 years. Microsoft used to have something called, and it's still there, called application registration, where you would register an application, and then you would have to get a key, and it was messy, and it had an ugly GUID that you had to create a user as. You don't have that any issue anymore with managed identities. It's very clean. It works with, you do have to be on a newer version of the SQL client, but you can just pass in a connection string. So like, okay, that did finally load up. And I just wanted to show you my connection string service. I'm hoping I didn't break the portal, but I think my IT is just slow. So yeah, you can just change the connection string slightly. It's pretty straightforward. Managed identities are definitely the way to go if you're building cloud authentication. All of this stuff runs on a protocol named OAuth. Read about it. Read about its risks, because there are some risks. That's how Microsoft has gotten kind of breached in recent months. Overall, the protocol is very secure. Microsoft did some stupid things and got caught. Multi-factor authentication is very important. One of the benefits of using Intra or Azure Active Directory authentication to SQL Server is it's a way you can require multi-factor authentication into even on-premises SQL Server. So that's something to keep in mind. And then the big thing here is to have layers of security. And I think this works with, really, I know I'm talking about cloud security, but it's going to apply everywhere. You don't want to just be dependent on one specific security control to rely on for your cloud security. You want to have layers. You want to have network security. You want to have good backups. You want to have multi-factor authentication. You want to have PIM and auditing and those kinds of things that allow you to see what's going on better. So backups. Most clouds have a native backup solution. Azure certainly does, and it mostly works pretty well, even with SQL Server. I know I'm pretty quick to call out infrastructure vendors who have backup solutions that don't work with database servers, but the Azure native backup solution works with SQL. It's kind of expensive. One of the things we do for a lot of our customers in Azure is we tell them not to do backups of their VMs. And the reason for this is that it takes a lot longer to restore a VM backup than it does to just create a new VM. Like a new SQL Server VM takes approximately 5 to 6 minutes to create rather, whereas a restore can take longer than an hour. And then you can just simply start restoring databases to that new VM. I understand a lot of people have regulatory requirements, so that's not always going to work. But that is a strategy we've done. SQL Server has that backup to URL functionality that's excellent. One of the things that's important to really understand about cloud backups is that the terms immutable and air-gapped are the key to any backup strategy in a modern security world. You want to make sure nobody can see your backups, and you want to make sure nobody can overwrite them. Write once, read many, that approach. Third-party backup solutions can help take care of this, and you want to keep software as a service solutions in mind. And it's important to ask your vendors about their database protection or their data protection policies. This happened a couple of years ago now, but Rackspace got ransomware attacked in their hosted exchange environment. And when I interviewed their CTO about it, and I kid you not, he told me we didn't have backups because we had a cluster. He didn't say that in those words exactly, but that was what he said. So when you're working with third-party vendors, you want to ask them about their systems and how they're protected and what their data protection policy is, and if there's a way you can back up your own data. Like with Office 365, you can back up your own email. Like I mentioned, with governance, you want to know what you have. You want to have different policies for different layers of data. So you can know how different types of data needs to be secured and protected. And the governance process needs to involve both the business and IT. It's not something IT can do alone. If you take one thing away from the security presentation is I want you to know that IT cannot be solely responsible for data governance. They can be, they just won't be any good at it. Tags are also something that's important to understand. This is just a way to tag resources in the cloud. All the vendors have this, and it just lets you identify resources, and you can do various automation approaches by using tags. Uh, kind of outside of the scope of the presentation in terms of security, but they are organizational and they can help you like identify tiers of systems that apply a lot of different controls, and they can better allow you to drive automation because you don't want to have to manually, especially when you get to where you have thousands of resources, you don't want to have to manually seek them out. You want to be able to easily identify them. And then finally, one of the things I always like to talk about in terms of disasters is, or security is having a plan. What do you do if you're attacked? What do you do if your data is breached? Uh, you want to be able to ensure that you have data integrity. You need to have a recovery plan. And really, realistically, a ransomware attack is probably the biggest threat you have to what we would traditionally call a disaster. You're more likely to have a ransomware attack than you are to have, say, your data center catch on fire. So have that as part of your disaster recovery plan. Understand, who's part of the team, what are the recovery details and procedures, how are you going to communicate in the event that you can't use email or Teams or anything like that, and have a plan for activating the plan. As Mike Tyson said, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. So it's important to have a good plan. So to close out, secure your network and your cloud portals. It should be hard to navigate around your network. One of the things that's a little bit annoying about security, but we have to do it, is that adding security controls makes everything harder. There's just no way around it. Having to go through jump host, having to have multi-factor authentication, having to have YubiKeys, all these things suck and they're painful, but they secure your environment better. Remember, you don't have to be the most secure environment. You have to be the second least secure. That's probably not a good goal, but you want to be more secure than the average environment. You want to understand where your data lives and where your sensitive data is so you can apply even tighter controls to that. You shouldn't necessarily apply the same level of control to all of your data because sometimes it may not be worth it. It might not be worth the hassle to go through the same level of data protection for the cafeteria menu system as it is your core ERP system. You want to have a plan for how to back up and restore your cloud data. And you want to understand with different types of data sources, whether they be storage accounts, cloud databases, VMs in the cloud, what the recovery path is for that data, and that you've tested it. You want to have a plan and test that plan. And your backup should be offsite and immutable. Offsite can mean a lot of things here. Basically, when I say that, I mean not very easily reachable from your network without some work. And really that work should kind of be manual. In some cases, I know I have customers that are going to just a completely different Azure tenant even for their backups, just so that they're completely isolated from their production environment. So the cloud adds another series of layers of complexity to your security, but it also gives you a lot of enterprise tools that, especially if you're a small organization, you may not have had in an on-premises world. You want to ask our hard questions to your cloud vendor, and this is probably a little bit harder if you're a small shop and you're dealing with Microsoft or Amazon, but they have all the tooling in place to give you good security, but you want to understand what the right approach is for you and your organization. You want to ask SaaS vendors, especially, what their backup and restore approach is, what their data loss SLA is. Those are all very important things to understand because they're not all the same. Even within Azure, like cloud services have different backup restore SLAs. For the longest time, Cosmos DB had a 30-minute data loss allowance, which not super cool. You also want to understand your data through governance, which can help you prioritize your restore and security processes. And don't try to start at zero from the cloud. Like if you have no cloud experience in your organization, reach out to a partner firm. I know this is a little bit self-serving, but we do a lot of stuff with the cloud. We know probably more about Azure than your average not consulting organization does, because we just work with it across so many clients and see those things. So if you're new to it, hire a partner. You can often get money for partner resources from your cloud vendor too. That's something to keep in mind. We have about 5 minutes left. Do we have any questions?
Let me look. Nope, nothing. This is really awesome. Anybody have questions, comments, observations? So Joey, you mentioned something about the network being the most important part of security, right? So Erin Dempster did actually do that a couple of weeks back, I believe. I think one before Monica. I mean, that was absolutely earth-shattering discussion. I never imagined what you just said today, right? That it's so important till then. So
yeah, the lateral movement is bad. That's the way those attacks work. Once they get in, if they can easily move across, they'll escalate.
Julie, you were saying something.
No, I didn't. Do you want me
Okay.
to turn off the
Okay,
recording
so
yet?
there are, yeah, you should actually, ideally. So we have some people who have casual